Hello, welcome friends. This is Elias Amare. Welcome to another episode of the Horn of Africa TV. Today we will be discussing on the current situation in Ethiopia. Ethiopia's war on terror, a few things explained. I'm taking this subtitle, a few things explained, from the poem of the great Chilean poet Pablo Neruda. His poem by the same title, A Few Things Explained, of 1937, the Spanish Civil War, the bombing of Guernica, the horror of war. And this was his response. I will be quoting a few lines or a couple of stanzas from that poem. Treacherous generals, see my dead house, look at the broken Spain. Come and see the blood in the streets. Come and see the blood in the streets. Come and see the blood in the streets. That was the great Pablo Neruda in his poem, A Few Things Explained. And so today we will have a few things explained about the situation in Ethiopia. There is a lot of disinformation out there, friends. Disinformation, propaganda, war by media, from the Western media, the pundits, the so-called experts, Africa experts, a lot of distortions, and a few diplomats and politicians are also muddying up the water, distorting, telling lies. But here in the Horn of Africa TV, we tell the truth. We call it as it is. We call the spade a spade. Tell it like it is what we do. So bear with us for about an hour, and we will go into lengths to explain the things that are happening in Ethiopia without any distortions, without any bias, objectively, and with some analysis. Well, to begin with, a lot of the Western media are explaining this as if it was a civil war between two equal sides. Some embassies in Addis Ababa are calling for, quote unquote, both sides to exercise maximum restraint and come to the table of negotiations, as if there are both sides in this conflict. There are no both sides, friends. Here, there is one side, the legitimate Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, led by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed Ali. And then there is that renegade group hiding in the northernmost province of Tigray, the TPLF, a bunch of thugs, ethno-fascist kleptocrats who have hijacked power there and are using the Tigrayan people as human shield to wage a war of terror on the rest of Ethiopia. That is what it is. This is how the situation is. On Monday last week, November the 2nd, in the dead of the night, the forces of the TPLF attacked a garrison or a base of the Federal Army, National Army, with the purpose of looting heavy weaponry, strategic missiles, to wage war on the rest of Ethiopia and even neighboring countries, if need be. This is what they have been saying for many weeks. The past weeks, they've been threatening war. They've been beating up the war drums. They have been on record calling up the people of Tigray to arms, using warmongering rhetoric. They're even calling children, women, and elderly to carry up guns. These group in Tigray, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, has been there in hiding for the past 2 years and a half, ever since they were ousted and fled helter-skelter to their home base of Tigray. There, they have been defiant. They have been threatening all kinds of shenanigans. They have been trying to disrupt the peace process currently underway between Eritrea and Ethiopia. They have been defiant of the Prime Minister. And finally, things have reached to this point where they are openly waging a war of terror. So this is not civil war at all. This is a war on terror, and the central government, the legitimate government, has all the right to restore law and order to all corners of the country. But how did things reach to this point? To understand that, then, we need to bring the historical context, the political historical context of the past 27 years of misrule of this minority group called TPLF, how they have been ruling the country, how they have been waging war in the Horn of Africa against Eritrea, against Somalia, and war even against the Ethiopian people, a war of terror, a war of genocide, ethnic cleansing, and instigating ethnic conflicts between various ethnic groups of the country in order to consolidate their minority rule. So ever since they came to power in 1991, this tiny minority group took it as their strategy that in order to rule Ethiopia, they come in from a very tiny population base, which is not more than 5% of the 100 million people of Ethiopia. They took it upon themselves that a divide and rule, ethno-apartheid, was the best way for them to consolidate their power and their rule and hegemony over the rest of Ethiopia. As such, they devised the constitution, put in place ethnic politics, and in this situation, they constantly fostered an atmosphere whereby various ethnic groups would be looking at each other suspiciously, always. There would be mistrust between peoples, and they would even from time to time ignite war or false flag operations to rouse the sentiments, the ethnic animosities. And that is how they have ruled for 27 years. This was a system of ethno-apartheid, an apartheid system based on creating ethnic Bantustans, dividing people along ethnic lines and pitting them against each other. And that way, this tiny minority group of kleptocrats were able to consolidate their power. Their biggest arsenal was the security apparatus. It is estimated that under the security apparatus, there were close to 100,000 operatives, full-time and part-time, some informants, some full-time terror squads, death squads, terrorizing the people constantly. This security apparatus had a huge budget at its disposal, a budget that coming from the wealth of the country. And this system of 1 to 5, they call it, Andel Amist in Amharic, whereby everybody was spying on everybody. Everybody was informing on everybody. One person had a cell network under him monitoring 5 people. This was a system called 1 to 5. And that is what they had. They were trained to terrorize the people. They were trained to constantly put the population on a level of tension and continuous mistrust against each other. And this is how they ruled the country. Elsewhere, they have also been conducting genocide in parts of the country, like the Gambela region, for instance. This is on record. Groups like Genocide Watch have charged that genocide had been taking in place in these parts of Ethiopia. In the Somali region, in the east also, genocide was taking place for well over 2 decades. Why? Because there, a low-intensity conflict was raging the Ogaden National Liberation Front was waging war against the central government. And so a very, very brutal war against the entire population, a counterinsurgency war was being conducted. And this, their policy was drain the sea to kill the fish. And in the Somali region of Ethiopia, they waged this relentless, brutal war of ethnic cleansing. Million people were displaced, and most of them went to refugee camps in Kenya, to the Dadaab refugee camps, for example. Many others were internally displaced. Tens of thousands of civilians were put in jail. The most infamous of these jails was Jail Ogaden. All these are documented. The atrocities that were perpetrated there in that unfortunate Somali region, the killing of civilians, rape of women, all kinds of horrible, horrible atrocities, crimes against humanity were perpetrated by this group. And so this is a group that has been guilty for war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide. For over 2 decades, this regime of the TPLF was propped up by Western countries, the United States chief among them, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Norway, Italy, all were supporting and propping it up, providing it with political cover. No charge, for example, was brought against the regime for genocide. Why? It was covered up by Western countries. It was their darling. It was fulfilling their wishes as an anchor state or client state ruling over the Horn of Africa region, or the greater Horn of Africa. It was an ally in the US war on terror. And so as such, it conducted with impunity all kinds of horrible atrocities against the people of Ethiopia. For example, in Sudan, the Darfur genocide, the West was up in arms there. It exposed the regime, rightfully so, and charged genocide. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, was involved there. Currently, the leaders of the former regime are in custody, in jail. Why then was no such charge brought on the TPLF regime of Ethiopia? These are questions that needed to be asked. These are the cries of agony of the Ethiopian people now, who have been crying out for justice. But this group, the TPLF, was safely ensconced in its northern province and conducting chaos and terror in the rest of Ethiopia for the past 2 years with impunity. The Prime Minister of the reformist government, Dr. Abiy Ahmed, tried all patience and with tolerance tried to engage them, to bring them to the table, but to no avail. And finally, last Monday, November 2nd, things reached the red line. This emboldened group of kleptocrats launched by night an attack on the National Army base of Ethiopia, killing scores of soldiers who were asleep, who never suspected that an attack would be coming on them. This is then what the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. And a day before that, in fact, in the Ethiopian parliament, the parliamentary representatives had had enough. The killings of innocent citizens in all parts of the country, instigated by this terrorist group of the TPLF, had outraged them. And so in justified anger, one by one, they rose up to condemn this group and said, enough is enough. This group has to be brought to justice. And the next day is when the TPLF launched its unwarranted attack on the army base. The purpose, as we have noted earlier, was to loot the strategic weaponry from the national army to enable it to wage war on the rest of Ethiopia. So, on the genocide that was happening in Somalia, in the rest of Ethiopia, we have a record by George Galloway, former member of the British Parliament, for years of the Labour Party, but then once he was out of the Labour Party, he got elected under the platform of the Respect Party. And in 2008, addressing the British Parliament, this is what he said about the Ethiopian regime of the TPLF and how the British government has been supporting it in its terroristic activities, be it inside Ethiopia or the rest of the region, especially Somalia. Let's take a listen to former British MP George Galloway.
Vote to move the adjournment.
Beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
Question is this House do now adjourn. George Galloway.
Speaker, a government ready to rely on those friends of liberty, the Democratic Unionist Party, to shred the liberties of our own people is almost by definition unembarrassable. But I hope this evening to add to the issues ventilated in a recent Channel 4 Dispatches programme to adumbrate the extent to which the tragedy in Somalia, which so many people are now becoming aware of, is another of our government's dirty little secrets. We must start the story in Ethiopia, where 4 million people, according to the United Nations, are facing starvation, and where 120,000 Ethiopian children have just 1 month to live, according to last week's media reports. Television viewers were shocked to see the pictures last week about the widespread suffering redolent of 1984 and the Great Famine of that year. The US and Britain immediately pledged $90 million in famine relief. Just 1 week after its appeal to the international community for famine relief, the Ethiopian government increased its military budget by $50 million to $400 million. The regime in Addis Ababa, when I knew them in the 1980s, Mr. Deputy Speaker, they were pro-Albanian Maoists, is the most militarized and heavily armed in Africa. It is in a state of perpetual war or preparation for war with one neighbour, Eritrea. It is supporting anti-government rebels with Western connivance, many believe, in Sudan. But most astonishing of all, the government of Ethiopia, this starving country, whose little children, fly-infested, kwashiorkor swollen, famished, famine-stricken children, has been encouraged, armed, trained, financed and otherwise facilitated to invade and occupy its neighbour Somalia and create a reign of terror in that land, which is testified to by this voluminous Amnesty International report, which if I had time I would extensively quote from. Somalia has lost thousands of dead as a result of the Ethiopian invasion. Millions have been displaced. Somalia, under Ethiopian occupation, is the grimmest prison state in Africa. Worse, far worse than Mugabe's Zimbabwe. And who has done the encouraging the arming, the training, the financing and the facilitating, the same US and British governments who donated the $90 million to the same Ethiopian government which is burning its money and burning the villages, the neighbourhoods and the people of occupied Somalia. This government is never done talking about the shortcomings of African leaders. Just last week in Rome, the Secretary of State for International Development was roaring at Robert Mugabe. Yet there has not been a squeak out of him or any other minister about the much bigger crime in which we are ourselves deeply complicit. Is it any wonder that African opinion considers so much of what we have to say about misgovernance in Africa to be the deepest, most cynical hypocrisy? 2 weeks ago, Channel 4's dispatches team took terrifying risks to bring us the latest from occupied Mogadishu. It was undoubtedly an award-winning documentary. It was memorable for many reasons, not least the scene in the FCO when the Minister, Lord Malach Brown, his face frozen in horror, was confronted by Adam Hartley with the central case of the documentary makers, which for those members who didn't see it, I know that the Minister will have seen it. She could hardly be sent out to bat on this wicket without being shown it, was this: that in the grim prison state of occupied Somalia, the fingerprints of our country and our government are all over the scene of the crime. The president of the puppet regime imposed by the Ethiopian army in Somalia turns out to be British. And guess what? Who is paying the wages of the murdering, kidnapping, torturing, quizzling police force in Ethiopian occupied Somalia? That's right, we are. The puppet dictatorship in Somalia is a very British crime, especially as our own government, especially the pocket-sized Palmerston, the Secretary of State hitherto referred to, is so very voluble on other problems in Africa. So how did we get here? How did we get into bed with the former pro-Albanian Maoists of the government in Addis Ababa? I'm afraid it's our old friend, our old acquaintance. The policy of my enemy's enemy is my friend. This policy, which has put us in so much trouble, from Afghanistan to Iraq and many other parts of the world, is what lies behind this obscene paradox. We're supporting the Ethiopian government's occupation of Somalia because George Bush told us to, because Somalia is a front line in George Bush's ill-conceived, counterproductive, utterly discredited, about to be booted out in the United States, so-called war on terror. The point is, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this policy is not only morally bankrupt, it is also politically disastrous. Afghanistan is the perfect case in point, and Ethiopia, which is presiding, the Ethiopian government presiding over a country where now famine and mass starvation stalks the land, is being helped militarily to invade and occupy its neighbours and threaten other of its neighbours. What can this conceivably do for our standing in Africa? What can this do for our credibility when we lecture the government of Sudan or the government of Zimbabwe? I hope that the Minister will come clean about the dreadful problems that exist. And I hope she'll say to the Ethiopian government, the Honourable Gentleman wishes to give way.
The Honourable Gentleman giving way. Can I congratulate him on his success in getting this debate this evening? I apologise that I've arrived late, Mr Deputy Speaker. It caught me slightly unawares. What's best for the Somalian people and Somalia itself, of course, is security. Does the Honourable Gentleman accept that the Ethiopian government are providing security in Somalia at the moment, and they want to withdraw from Somalia at the earliest possible moment? And would he join me in encouraging the United Nations and in AMISOM and also the African Union to ensure that troops are put back into Somalia in order to give Somalis that security that they need? Ethiopian troops want to return to Addis Ababa.
Well, I don't accept it. I don't accept it at all, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I know the Ethiopian government rather better it seems, than the honourable gentleman. As I explained before he came in, I knew them when they were pro-Albanian Maoist guerrillas in the TPLF. I knew all their leaders who are now the government ministers. I know that they have no intention of withdrawing from Somalia unless they're forced to. They want to occupy Somalia because they've been paid to do so. And they were paid to do so by the governments of the United States and by our own government. They're doing a job for what they imagine to be the Western part of the international community. The truth is that the Ethiopian government is carrying out a service for the people who give it weapons, for the people who give it money, and for the people who give it diplomatic and political support. They're having a Beano in the Ethiopian embassy next week. Perhaps the honourable gentleman is going. He'll certainly get an invitation in the post after his intervention on my speech. They're having a Beano to celebrate the 17th anniversary in the Ethiopian embassy in London of their coming to power. It's going to be a very grand event. This at a time when their own people are starving to death. Their children are starving to death, 120,000 of them, with a month to live, and they're invading and occupying their neighbouring countries. And nobody says boo about it. In fact, far from saying boo, they say, here's some more military and some more financial aid to do it. Because the government of President Bush, utterly discredited, on its way out, with virtually nowhere to go except Downing Street on Sunday for one last photo call, regards that the defeat of the former Islamic government in Somalia as part of its war on terror. That's what this is all about. Ethiopia is playing the role of hammer in the Horn of Africa for the United States policy and its war on terror.
Okay, that was George Galloway, former member of the Respect Party in the British Parliament in 2008, exactly 12 years ago, charging the British government of aiding and abetting this terroristic group, the TPLF regime, which was then in power in Ethiopia. So for 27 years, from 1991 up to 2018, this regime of the minority Tigrayan People's Liberation Front lorded it over the rest of Ethiopia, and it is minority rule. In these 27 years, it is estimated that the group had looted and plundered Ethiopia's wealth to the tune of 70 billion US dollars. That's billion with a B. This is an unprecedented kleptocracy, never witnessed in the African continent in the past 60 years of the post-colonial period. People say that Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire was a kleptocrat, that his regime or he himself stole 5 billion US dollars and deposited them in European banks, Swiss banks, French banks. But what Mobutu stole from the people of Congo was a mere child's play to what these kleptocrats of the TPLF stole from Ethiopia. $70 billion is what they stole. Where did this money come from? A huge part of it from loans from different countries, debt. So the country is left saddled with huge debt that is going to be unable to pay for decades to come. It also stole the money from illegal activities, from mineral resources that the countries that should have gone to the country's treasury, gold, selling huge parcels of land in land grab schemes to foreign agents, contraband, remittance, illegal drug trafficking, human trafficking. This was what its army generals were involved in, and its security apparatus also. these TPLF kleptocrats bled Ethiopia dry. Never had Ethiopia seen in the past 120 years of its modern history such horrendous level of kleptocracy that ruined the country. This was the TPLF. This is the TPLF group that is now conducting war on the rest of Ethiopia. Also, the TPLF, as I have stated earlier, conducted wars of aggression, first against Eritrea in 1998, under the pretext of a border dispute that never was really. Badme, as later was found out by the International Arbitration Court at The Hague, the Eritrea-Ethiopia Boundary Commission, was clearly inside Eritrean territory, well within the international boundary line. The TPLF knew well that Badme was deep inside Eritrean territory, but it used it as a casus belli, as a pretext to launch a war against Eritrea. In this war, over 100,000 of Ethiopian soldiers, most of them conscripted from poor peasant families, perished, all in order to ensure the TPLF's hegemony of power in Ethiopia. The war against Eritrea in 1998 was launched in order to hoodwink the rest of Ethiopia and to lengthen or give itself more time, to buy time and ensure its hegemony over the rest of Ethiopia. A few years later, in 2006, Ethiopia also launched a war of aggression against Somalia. This was an illegal war. Eritrea at that time was the only country that protests this invasion. But yet, the regional organization, IGAD, the African Union, all were derelict in their duty to condemn this illegal invasion of a sovereign nation, Somalia. Why did the TPLF launch this war of aggression on Somalia? Why did it invade Somalia? The pretext was war on terror. But in reality, it was merely fulfilling the wishes of its patrons, the United States government, in a wrong, misguided war and terror that should never have been. Somalia at that time, after decades of instability, was stabilizing. The Union of Islamic Courts had brought some semblance of stability and central government to the country. The era of warlords in Somalia was coming to the end. But this was not in the interest of the great powers, Western powers. And so the TPLF regime fulfilled their wishes, was very glad to play the part and invaded Somalia. And for that, it was amply rewarded, as George Galloway noted in that parliamentary speech, by the British government, by the United States government, by the European Union, by Germany and other European countries. It was this huge financial support that enabled it to terrorize the rest of the Ethiopian people for 27 years. So we must never forget that those who are now shedding crocodile tears and calling for both sides to exercise maximum restraint and come to the negotiation table, calling for dialogue and what have you, those were the same political forces of the West that had been propping up this criminal gang of kleptocrats, the TPLF, to stay in power in Ethiopia. And so we must be clear. That must be condemned. If there was any justice, many of the Western governments who had been complicit over the past decades in prolonging the agony and suffering of the Ethiopian people must now have been ashamed of their past sins. And instead of making amends, however, they are now trying to beautify the ugly pig of the TPLF, to put lipstick to the proverbial pig, and to put it on the same balance as the central government. There is no way that the TPLF terroristic group and the central federal government can be put on par, on the same table. No way. This is unjustifiable. It is by no standard can it be justified. As we have explained, the history of this TPLF group since 1991 up to the present is filled with blood, terror, genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. We must keep reminding the Western experts, the Western media, and Western governments that this is unjustifiable. It is a shameful act. The regime that had been terrorizing the people was finally overthrown by popular protest, a wave of popular protest. Thousands of people died. And finally, the TPLF minority rule was brought to an end in 2018. A reformist government led by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed Ali came to power. It started to reform. It brought in many of the opposition parties who were in exile. It freed thousands of political prisoners, so-called political prisoners who were suffering in the dungeons of the TPLF jails. It was, for a brief period, some hope. But as we have noted then, particularly in my article that I remember having written in March 2018, the link of which is in the description below, I said the TPLF is not going to give up power easily. Knowing this group and their vindictiveness and their being a narrow, frightened group, they will pursue all kinds at their disposal to unleash on the rest of Ethiopia a reign of chaos and instability. This TPLF's strategy of chaos was to be implemented through its network of terror that it built under the security apparatus that it controlled in 27 years of its misrule in Ethiopia. So it fled to its home base in Tigray, yes, but all the database, all the network was in its disposal. And in the past 2 years, that is what it did. It unleashed on the rest of Ethiopia an unrelenting war of terror, or terroristic war rather, through the cells it created. It had vast means of financial means at its disposal, arms and what have you. And so in all corners of the country, that is what we have been witnessing the past 2 years and a half. Safely from its hiding place in Tigray, it attempted assassination on the Prime Minister of Ethiopia back in June of 2018, just a few months after he came to power. Fortunately, those dark, evil forces sent by the TPLF were foiled and brought to custody. A year later, it also instigated assassination of the leaders of the Amhara region and the chief of staff of the Ethiopian army. These kinds of political assassinations went on. 4 or 5 months ago, the famous Ethiopian Oromo artist, Hachalu Hundessa, was also killed in order to instigate an ethnic violence, in particular between the two major ethnic groups of Ethiopia, the Oromo and the Amhara. There is no doubt that it was the TPLF who was behind this assassination. Sure, it may have had some accomplices who pulled the trigger of the gun that killed the great Hachalu Hundessa, but the plan, the financial wherewithal, and everything else was orchestrated by the TPLF criminal gang in Mekelle. This is what has been happening in Ethiopia. We have to be very clear on this. For the past 2 years and a half, as I have said earlier, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed Ali, with great patience, and his government, with great patience, tried to engage this group, tried to reason with it, tried to bring them to the fold, so to speak, or those elements within the group whom he thought were reasonable and rational and who were not participatory in the crimes, the overall crimes of the TPLF. But the TPLF remained defiant. It, in fact, was emboldened to carry out its evil mission or evil strategy of chaos in the rest of Ethiopia with impunity. Finally, things have reached to this point, and under such circumstances, any responsible government would be foolhardy to continue the policy of appeasement with such a group. The red line had been crossed, as the Prime Minister of Ethiopia said it in his speech on Tuesday, November 3rd. The patience had run out, and so appropriate measures are being taken to bring this criminal gang into justice. So all other attempts to provide political cover for this terroristic group then are nothing but aiding and abetting criminals. And they must be condemned by all peace and justice loving people of Ethiopia, the Horn of Africa, and the world for that matter. Enough is enough. Justice must be done. The spade must be called a spade. The group of terrorists must be called terrorists. And the war they are unleashing is nothing but terrorism. And so this is Ethiopia's war on terror. Ethiopia cannot find peace and stability unless this group is brought to justice, and Ethiopia then would be able to move forward in a political atmosphere of stability. Free and fair elections would be able to be conducted. The TPLF gang, in fact, its main aim was to sabotage the coming elections to be conducted in June of 2021, according to the schedule of the National Election Board. It had previously, a month or so ago, in an attempt to defy the federal government against the National Election Board's ruling that under the current situation of COVID pandemic, it is impossible to conduct elections in Ethiopia. The TPLF went ahead and conducted unilateral election in its region. The federal parliament, in particular, the upper house, the federal council, condemned this illegal act and called the election null and void. The prime minister tried to reason with the group that there was no reason to conduct this election, that election would be conducted when the National Election Board saw fit that the threat of the pandemic was over or minimal and elections could be conducted. But this was an act of defiance that the TPLF group had been engaged in for the past 2 years and a half. It wanted to undermine the central government, central authority, and to create an atmosphere of instability. It had hoped that other ethno-fascist groups in the rest of Ethiopia would join it in its defiance, and that there would be civil war that would lead to the disintegration of Ethiopia, thereby fulfilling its secessionist ambitions, enabling it to secede. But where would this dream of secessionism, it's a pipe dream, where would Tigray go? Tigray seceding from the rest of Ethiopia is like, as an American analyst recently said on Twitter, is like Alabama trying to secede from the United States. Well, at least Alabama has a sea coast. I would say that Tigray trying to secede from the rest of Ethiopia is as untenable as, say, Idaho or Iowa trying to secede from Ethiopia, from the United States, I mean, excuse me. It is untenable. It's just a pipe dream. And yet, we hear over and over by Western so-called experts, disinformation experts, they are nothing else, trying to say that the TPLF is going to secede, Ethiopia is going to disintegrate. No such thing will come to Ethiopia. Ethiopia is not going to disintegrate because of this terrorist group. In fact, it is way overdue that this terrorist group should have been brought to justice much, much earlier, 2 years and a half ago, not now. The other thing that the Western media is currently engaged in its disinformation campaign is to portray this as if Eritrea has a hand in this war. This is absolute lies, totally false and baseless. Eritrea has no hand in this. Why would Eritrea be engaged in this internal matter of Ethiopia? True, Eritrea is always alert and watchful that this terrorist group doesn't try to instigate a war in the border in order to widen the war. But just like Sudan, Eritrea is on the alert. Sudan is also on the alert. It has closed its border crossings in the Humara western part. Eritrea also is on the alert. It is watchful. Its army is on standby, but it is not involved at all. Le Monde Diplomatique, for example, the well-known French mainstream newspaper, earlier on tried to insinuate that this was the hand of Eritrea and President Elias Amare of Eritrea. Of course, the Eritrean Ministry of Information has given an apt rebuttal and exposed these lies. But we observe also other Western media outlets such as New York Times, Bloomberg News, AFP, Agence France Presse, Reuters, The Guardian, BBC, and so on and so forth, are singing the same tune of disinformation, lies, and propaganda against Eritrea. And we have to call a spade and expose these lies, because they are nothing but lies. They have been engaged in these lies for decades against Eritrea. It doesn't come as a surprise, but then the rest of the people of Ethiopia know what is happening there. The whole people of Ethiopia have sided with their government. They have had enough of this TPLF group, and they know that Eritrea has absolutely no hand in this. It is, of course, inevitable that in such a situation, the forcibly conscripted Tigrayan militias are fleeing away from the TPLF regime. Some of them are fleeing to and giving up peacefully to the Amhara region, some to Sudan, still some more to Eritrea. That is all what is happening in this case. When such peacefully fleeing militias from Tigray come across the border to Eritrea, Eritrea, of course, would welcome them, would disarm them, but put them in camps until it is safe for them to return to their country. We must not forget that tens of thousands of poor peasants of Tigray have been forcibly conscripted by the TPLF in its attempt to widen the war against the rest of Ethiopia. The TPLF currently is also arming child soldiers. We have not heard any condemnation of this from the so-called human rights watchdogs of the West. Why? Why are they keeping silent? This is obviously something to be condemned. To send children to war is abominable, an absolute shameful, disgraceful act that all people of conscience must condemn. The TPLF openly has said that it is going to arm even children. Its leader, the leader of the regime, the TPLF group, Debretsion Gebremichael, has said this repeatedly in his speeches. There are footages, pictures of child soldiers currently in the Amhara region. Child soldiers which were involved in the war and were wounded are in hospital getting treatment. Why is the Western media silent on this? Why is it not exposing this? Why is it trying to cover up the brutality of the TPLF? Is it not enough that for 27 years it covered up for the TPLF while it was conducting with impunity a war of terror on the Ethiopian people and the rest of the peoples of the Horn of Africa? Is that not enough? Is the aim then of this Western media and their governments to perpetuate instability and chaos in Ethiopia? If so, then the people of Ethiopia are watching. They are observing. They are not fools. They have been conscious of what has been going on for the past 27 years. You cannot fool the people all the time. As one American leader said it many years ago, over 100 years ago. You may be able to fool the people for some time, some people for some time. You may be able to fool all the people for some time, but you cannot fool all the people for all the times. And so time is up for their lies. This is the few things that we need to explain. This is the truth that we tell in order to expose the lies of the Western pundits, the so-called experts, the think tank analysts, the crisis vultures or conflict vultures that have been, in fact, benefiting from the past decades. Some may have been even in the service, in the paid service of the TPLF regime. Time now is running out. They have to stop these lies. These are the few things we wanted to explain. Another thing, many of the political parties in Ethiopia have took a courageous stand and supported the government's measures. Such parties as the Ethiopian Citizens for Social Party, or Social Justice, forgive me, or the Izema in Amharic. The Somali regional state, for instance, had convened a meeting, an urgent meeting, in which elders and many political groups discussed the matter, and they condemned the TPLF for its past atrocities over the Somali people and called for the government to bring them to justice. They supported the Prime Minister and the federal government in its current war on terror on the TPLF. These are a few of the things that are happening in Ethiopia. Elsewhere in the region, the TPLF had been hoping that it would have external support, but no external support is forthcoming. In this war adventure, it is alone, it is isolated. It is even isolated from the people of Tigray. It is trying to fool the rest of the world that the people of Tigray are with it. The fact of the matter is that the people of Tigray are also fed up and have finally said enough. In the coming days, we will see thousands and thousands of the militias, the forcibly conscripted militias fleeing from this war. And they should. This is not their war. The people of Tigray have nothing to benefit from the TPLF's war and reckless adventurism. Many Tigrayans, whether it's in the diaspora or inside the country in Ethiopia, are openly condemning the TPLF's war of aggression and adventurism, warmongering, and they are calling on their fellow compatriots, Tigrayan people, who are just like the rest of the people of Ethiopia, for peace. They do not want anything to do with the TPLF's war. Why is the Western media not covering this? Why is it telling lies? These are the truths that the rest of the world needs to know. And so it is encouraging that the Prime Minister of Ethiopia is coming to address his people firstly, and the rest of the world also in English, explaining the matter as it is. But it's also incumbent on other Ethiopians from all sectors of society, from the broad political spectrum, intellectuals in particular, to come and address the people of the world and explain to them what is happening on the ground, because disinformation is in full force. As I have been saying again and again in this Horn of Africa TV programs with my colleague, the great political analyst, Professor Mohammed Hassan, the TPLF is a criminal gang that needs to be brought to justice. Sooner or later, it will be emboldened and it will unleash chaos with the hope of widening the war and creating a civil war atmosphere in Ethiopia in order to have Ethiopia to disintegrate the country and thus enable its dreams of creating the greater Tigray that it had in place since its inception in 1976. But the dream of greater Tigray is just a pipe dream. It will never happen. It can never happen. No country in Africa is going to support it. The African Union is not going to support it. The Tigray people, the people of Tigray should or know this very well also. They do not want to secede from the rest of Ethiopia. There are no grounds for secession in Ethiopia at all. The TPLF, of course, ignited this war in order to create a situation of chaos and terror, and thus bring about its evil dream of the disintegration of Ethiopia. But the Western media will not tell you this. It will hide these facts. We will not hide those facts. We will tell the truth as we see it. We will call the spade a spade. We will call the terrorist a terrorist. And the TPLF group is a group of terrorists which is guilty of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And it is about time that it must be brought to justice. In this war, the side of the federal government of Ethiopia is on the side of justice. It is on the side of the Ethiopian people. It wants to bring peace and stability to the country. Just like in Nigeria, the federal government of Nigeria conducted the war on the Boko Haram terrorist group, so is also the federal government waging this mop-up operation to bring the terrorist group to justice, the terrorist group that the TPLF. TPLF is the Boko Haram of Ethiopia. Plain and simple. That is an appropriate analogy which must be placed in the minds of those who are now hypocritically shedding crocodile tears and calling for both sides to exercise restraint and come back to the negotiating table. There is no negotiation with terrorists. Terrorists get only emboldened when they hear such words. The only way to deal with them is through a language that they understand. So, to wrap up then, in this past week, we have witnessed that the tide has turned against the TPLF. The entire population of Ethiopia is in an uproar. They have had enough of this terroristic shenanigans of this group. They want justice to be done. They want their stolen lands to be returned. They want their stolen money to be returned. And they want to bring an end to the ignominious period of the TPLF's terroristic reign on Ethiopia since 1991. This is how it is. And we are telling it like it is here in the Horn of Africa TV. Until next time, I am Elias Amare. Salam.